Hello everyone and welcome to my channel YNR Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Nick didn't discover the truth all at once so much as he felt it coiling around him for weeks, tightening every time Sharon's smile arrived a second too late, every time her eyes drifted past him toward some invisible horizon, every time she flinched when his hand brushed hers as though the contact burned rather than comforted her. And on the night the truth finally detonated, it wasn't with a shout or a confession but with the quietest, cruelest sound of all. The soft click of the door at crimson lights as Sharon locked up, unaware Nick was still there, standing in the shadows between the shelves and the memories, watching as she leaned back against the counter and whispered a name that wasn't his, a name that sliced through him with surgical precision. Matt. It was then that the past rewrote itself in Nick's mind with brutal clarity. Every rejection suddenly acquiring a face and a reason, because Sharon hadn't pulled away out of fear or confusion or timing. She had pulled away because her heart had already crossed a line she was too ashamed, too conflicted, too loyal to admit. And as he stepped forward, the floor seemed to groan under the weight of everything unspoken, his voice steady only because shock had frozen it in place when he asked her why she had spent months telling him she needed space, needed to heal, needed to be alone, when clearly she wasn't alone at all. Not in the way that mattered, and Sharon's head snapped up, her eyes wide and wet and instantly guilty, and in that single look Nick saw the answer before she ever said a word, saw the love she had tried to bury and failed to kill, saw Matt's ghost standing between them like an uninvited god, and when she finally spoke it came out in fragments, apology stitched together with fear, explaining how it started quietly, innocently, how Matt had been there during the nights when the world felt heavy and Nick was elsewhere fighting his own demons. How friendship blurred into something deeper before she had the strength to stop it, how she hated herself for it every single day. And Nick listened with a numb smile that didn't reach his eyes, because what hurt wasn't just that she loved someone else but that she had chosen silence over honesty, mercy over truth, deciding on his behalf what he could and couldn't handle. And as she confessed that she had rejected him not because she didn't love him at all, but because loving him felt like a lie, when her heart surged every time Matt walked into a room, Nick felt anger ignite beneath the shock, sharp and cleansing, and demanded to know if Matt knew. If this was some secret exchanged in glances and half-smiles, and Sharon shook her head fiercely, insisting that Matt had no idea, that this was her burden alone, her private war. And for a moment Nick almost laughed at the irony, because secrecy had always been Sharon's poison, and yet here she was drinking it again, convinced she could survive the dose. And as the tension crackled between them like exposed wire, Nick realized the rejection that had haunted him wasn't a judgment of his worth but a sacrifice Sharon had convinced herself was noble, as if stepping aside quietly would somehow spare everyone pain. And that realization hurt more than the rejection itself, because it meant she still loved him in her way, just not enough to choose him. And when he asked her the question that had been burning since the moment he heard Matt's name, whether she was in love with Matt, Sharon's silence stretched so long it felt like an answer carved into stone. And when she finally nodded, tears spilling freely now, Nick's chest hollowed out with a soundless collapse, the future he had imagined dissolving into fragments too small to salvage. And he told her then, quietly, devastatingly, that loving someone else while holding on to him wasn't protection, it was cruelty. And Sharon tried to reach for him but he stepped back, not out of spite but self-preservation, because seeing her hurt didn't heal him. And as he turned to leave he understood with aching clarity that the real betrayal wasn't Matt or fate or timing but the truth withheld, the choice Sharon made every day to reject him without giving him the dignity of knowing why. And outside the cafe the night air felt brutal and clean and unforgiving as Nick walked away, unaware that from across the street Matt had witnessed the entire exchange through the window, his own shock mirroring Nick's, the realization dawning that he had become the axis of a storm he never meant to create, setting the stage for a fallout that would shatter loyalties, expose buried desires, and change all three of their lives forever. Part 2 unfolded not with calm reflection but with consequence, because the moment Nick disappeared into the night the fragile equilibrium holding Sharon's secret together shattered, and the silence she had relied on as a shield turned into a weapon aimed squarely at her own heart, especially when she looked up and saw Matt no longer a distant, abstract name but a living presence across the street, frozen in place as though the truth had rooted him to the pavement, his face pale with the unmistakable horror of recognition, because even without hearing the words he had seen enough, the way Nick's shoulders sagged, the way Sharon reached out too late, The way a love he hadn't known existed had just detonated. And when Matt finally crossed the street and pushed open the cafe door, the bell chiming with cruel normalcy, Sharon felt the room shrink around them, every memory pressing in, every boundary she had drawn dissolving in an instant as Matt asked her, in a voice barely above a whisper, whether what he thought he'd just witnessed was real, and Sharon, stripped of denial at last, could only nod, the truth landing between them like broken glass, because now it wasn't just Nick who knew, it was Matt too, and that knowledge changed the gravity of every breath. Matt's first instinct was disbelief, a reflexive insistence that she was mistaken, that grief and loneliness had blurred her feelings, that whatever she thought she felt couldn't possibly be love because love carried responsibility, and he had never crossed that line with her, never even imagined it, but Sharon stopped him with a single shattered sentence. That love didn't ask permission, it only demanded honesty once it arrived. And for a long moment they stood there facing each other, the unsaid roaring louder than any argument, until Matt admitted the truth he hadn't allowed himself to examine, that somewhere along the way Sharon had become the person he measured his days against, the voice he listened for, the absence he felt too keenly when she wasn't near, and the admission terrified him because it meant he had been standing on the edge of something dangerous without realizing how far he'd leaned. And yet even as that realization bloomed, guilt clawed at him, because Nick's devastation replayed in his mind with merciless clarity, and Matt knew then that no version of this story ended without someone bleeding. Sharon, overwhelmed, tried to frame her silence as protection, insisting she never intended to act on her feelings, that rejecting Nick had been her way of preventing a greater betrayal, but Matt's response was raw and unfiltered as he told her that unchosen love still left wreckage, that secrets didn't neutralize damage, they delayed it until the impact was worse, and as his words sank in, Sharon finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had done, not just to Nick, but to Matt as well, dragging him into an emotional war he never agreed to fight. Meanwhile, across town, Nick sat alone with the truth like a live wire in his hands, replaying Sharon's confession again and again, each repetition stripping away another layer of illusion until anger gave way to something colder and more dangerous, clarity, and with it came the resolve to stop being the passive casualty of someone else's fear. So when morning broke, Nick didn't seek comfort or distraction, he sought answers, confronting Matt directly with a precision that left no room for evasion, asking whether Matt had feelings for Sharon and whether he intended to pretend otherwise now that the truth was exposed. And Matt, already fractured by guilt, refused to lie, admitting the feelings but insisting he never acted on them, a distinction that mattered deeply to him but rang hollow to Nick, because intention didn't erase outcome, and Nick told him then that love without courage was still a choice, that standing silently while Sharon rejected him again and again had made Matt complicit whether he meant to be or not. The confrontation ended without reconciliation, only a shared understanding that their friendship, once solid, now rested on fault lines that might never stabilize, and as the day wore on the fallout spread outward like ripples, alliances strained, loyalties questioned, the town quietly sensing a shift even before the truth fully surfaced, because secrets that large never stayed contained for long. Sharon, caught between two men she loved in different, devastating ways, finally understood the cost of avoidance, realizing that by trying to spare everyone pain she had multiplied it, and when she stood alone that night, staring at her reflection and seeing not a victim of circumstance but an architect of chaos, she made the hardest decision yet. Not to choose Nick or Matt, but to choose honesty, no matter who it hurt or what it destroyed, because love built on silence had already proven itself lethal. And as she prepared to face the storm she had unleashed, one truth echoed louder than all the rest. The shock wasn't that she was in love with Matt, but that the lie she told herself, that rejection was kindness, had been the most damaging betrayal of all. Part 3 arrived like the calm before a catastrophe that everyone could feel but no one could outrun, because honesty, once chosen, doesn't enter quietly. It storms in and demands witnesses, and Sharon's decision to stop hiding set off a chain reaction that rewrote every fragile relationship in its path, beginning with the moment she asked both Nick and Matt to meet her at the one place that had always symbolized second chances, the very room where so many promises had been made and broken, and when they arrived, separately, guarded, already wounded, the air thickened with history and unfinished grief, Nick standing rigid with a restraint that spoke of sleepless nights and hard resolve, Matt visibly shaken, carrying guilt like a second skin, and Sharon at the center of it all, trembling not with fear of what she would lose but with the certainty that she would lose something no matter what she said, because truth is not a cure, It's a reckoning. She didn't ease into it, didn't soften the edges this time, because she knew now that half-truths were just lies in gentler clothing, and so she told them everything. The beginning, the moment she dismissed, the way love had crept in without permission and rooted itself despite her resistance, the nights she chose silence over courage, the reason she rejected Nick again and again while convincing herself it was for his own good. And as she spoke, Nick's composure finally cracked, not into rage but into something far more devastating. A quiet acknowledgement that he had felt it all along, the distance, the hesitation, the absence of choice, and that what hurt most was realizing he had been fighting for a place in her life that had already been occupied by someone else's shadow. Matt, meanwhile, struggled under the weight of being named as the center of a love he hadn't fully claimed but could no longer deny, confessing that hearing it spoken aloud stripped away every excuse he had hidden behind, because intentions no longer mattered when the emotional truth stood bare between them, and he admitted that while he hadn't acted, he had felt, and feeling without boundaries had been its own betrayal. The confrontation escalated not into shouting but into something more raw, more human, as Nick challenged Matt to explain how loyalty could survive unspoken desire, and Matt countered that restraint without honesty was still a failure of courage, the two men circling the same wound from opposite sides, realizing that neither of them could walk away clean from this story, because Sharon's silence had not only divided love but distorted responsibility. And then came the moment no one expected, when Sharon, instead of pleading or choosing, stepped back and claimed accountability fully, telling them she would not ask for forgiveness she hadn't earned, would not beg either of them to stay, because the pattern of her life had been shaped by fear dressed up as protection, and she refused to repeat it again, even if it meant standing alone. And that declaration shifted something fundamental, because for the first time Sharon wasn't reacting to love, she was owning the consequences of it. Nick saw then that whatever remained between them could never return to what it was, because trust, once fractured by omission, didn't rebuild on nostalgia, and though part of him still loved her fiercely, he understood that staying would mean betraying himself, and so he told her goodbye not with bitterness but with finality, choosing clarity over comfort, walking away with the painful dignity of someone who finally stopped asking to be chosen. Matt, left behind in the echo of that departure, faced a truth even harder to swallow, that love offered without timing or integrity could become a burden rather than a gift, and though his feelings for Sharon were real, he recognized that stepping forward now would look too much like victory built on someone else's loss, and he wasn't sure he could live with that, leaving Sharon once again confronted by the cost of delayed honesty. Yet the fallout didn't end there, because secrets of this magnitude never remain contained, and as whispers spread and loyalties fractured, the town itself seemed to take sides, each judgment a reminder that private choices carry public consequences, and Sharon, stripped of illusion at last, began the long, lonely work of rebuilding not a romance but herself, learning that love without courage corrodes everyone it touches. And somewhere in the distance, as Nick forged a new path defined by self-respect rather than longing, and Matt wrestled with the weight of feelings he could no longer ignore, the shock that once centered on a hidden love evolved into something deeper and more unsettling, the realization that the most dangerous lies are the ones told in the name of kindness, and that sometimes the greatest drama isn't who ends up together, but who finally learns to walk away whole. Sharon made her decision because choosing honesty didn't bring peace. It stripped away the last illusion that any of them could return to who they were before, and as the night deepened, Sharon found herself alone in the quiet aftermath, the cafe lights dimmed, the echoes of Nick's pain and Matt's conflicted silence pressing in until breathing felt like an act of defiance. Across town, Nick stood at his window watching the city glow with indifferent life, realizing that the heartbreak wasn't just about losing Sharon but about losing the future he had been quietly building in his mind, a future that now felt foolish and naive, and with that realization came a hard resolve, to stop orbiting a love that could never fully choose him, no matter how genuine it once felt. Meanwhile, Matt sat with his hands clasped, staring at nothing, understanding for the first time that love discovered too late could be as destructive as love acted upon too soon, and that by staying silent he had allowed Sharon to dismantle her own life brick by brick while he stood safely to the side, telling himself restraint was virtue when it was really fear. The truth settled uneasily in all three of them at once, binding them together even as it forced them apart, because none of them could claim innocence anymore, only varying degrees of responsibility. And as dawn crept in, Sharon understood that the shock wasn't just that Nick had learned why she rejected him, or even that Matt now knew the depth of her feelings, but that honesty had revealed something far more brutal, that love once exposed doesn't guarantee connection, only consequence, and the storm she had tried so desperately to avoid had finally arrived, not in one explosive moment, but in the quiet certainty that nothing between them would ever be simple, safe, or the same again.